I'll be teaching a course this winter semester at St. Stephen's University on myth and meaning in the Inklings. There's been a tendency in Western civilization to overplay or overstress a certain scientific or rationalistic approach to life, in which just what can be verified and falsified through the senses is only the thing that's acceptable, and everything has to prove its case before the court of rationalism, inductive, deductive, logical way of thinking, and this assumed gives us objective information. The rest is just pure flighty subjectivity, which has no relevance really for thoughtful people. Now, the counter to that, which has come along, rightly so, has been the important role of myth. I think this partially explains the role of, say, Jordan Peterson and his role and interest in myth. Peterson doesn't go to the depth and the richness and the fullness of, for example, the Inklings, but part of his appeal, he's saying, in a fragmented world, in a post-structural world, there are stories that tell us stories about ourselves, and to the degree we heed those stories, we become deeper, mature, more meaningful people on our journey with ourselves and with others and in society. Now, this turn to myth is not new. Peterson will turn to Carl Jung and many other people as well in terms of the great stories from comparative civilizations in myth. But the Inklings themselves were at the forefront of recovering, restoring, and also creating their own myths for our time. The course will begin with George MacDonald, who C.S. Lewis considered his master. George MacDonald was brilliant in his understanding of myth and telling stories. And I'll begin the course with two of his more accessible stories, The Princess and the Goblin, The Princess and Curdie, then move on to Phantastes, which is a great work of formation and transformation, in which Anytus has to learn about himself on his journey. He has a superficial understanding of the good, the true, and the beautiful, but it has to be tested by going through the fires of time in that sense. And so it's MacDonald very much using story and myth to look at the nature of transformation, of dying and resurrection and becoming a new person. I'll then move on to Owen Barfield, who is a very good friend with Bede Griffiths and C.S. Lewis, as Lewis was coming to Christianity, but his fine little story, The Silver Trumpet, is one of the great works of literature, which is not often read a lot. I've been in touch with his grandson, who's also called Owen Barfield, and they're trying to reprint The Silver Trumpet. It's very costly at the present time, so I wouldn't expect students to buy it. But so we'll move then from George MacDonald to Barfield, and Barfield takes us right into then C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and both people were very indebted to both Barfield and George MacDonald. And so I'll be touching, most people obviously would be aware, for those who are interested in myth and have a bit of a history in the Inklings, they would know Lewis through his space trilogy, Chronicles of Narnia. But I'll be touching on some of the other very important little works as well that often people don't read a lot. The same with Tolkien. Most would know him through Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. I'll be looking at Leaf by Niggle, Smith of Wootton Major, and a variety of other works in which he introduces the notion of fairy. Fairy is not, people often, again, like myth, have a misunderstanding. And when they think of myth, some people at a popular level, it's a falsehood, it's an untruth, whereas myth, in sense of that deeper meaning, it's eternal truths wrapped in the garment of thoughtful stories. And fairy, what Tolkien is trying to get at as well, there are deeper truths, and we live in thin places. And when we rinse our eyes of our soul and our imagination, we'll begin to see in a way perhaps we don't even see at the present time. And the more our soul, our imagination, our mind is open to bigger things, the more our life will move along in a richer, in a fuller way. I'll then move on to Charles Williams. I might touch on The Place of the Lion, but he did some fine works on the Arthurian tradition as well. I'll finish the course with Roger Lancel Green. I've called him the orphaned Inkling because he's often not recognized as a part of that Inkling family. But he, in fact, wrote more books on myth than probably any of the Inklings, synthesizing Egyptian myth, a whole variety of works on Greek and Roman myth. the English myths of the Arthurian tradition, and then Robin Hood, the great Nordic myths themselves of Iceland and Scandinavia, and Odin, Loki, and Balder, which so influenced Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, as well as George MacDonald for that matter. And so the course on myth and meaning in the Inklings is first of all going to look at why myth is important, why it's central, and how the soul dies. It shrinks without myth, without story, without parable, without narrative. And then tap into some of the great, not only recoverers of myth, but makers of myth, of which the Inklings are key figures. Inkling, of course, they not only use ink, but they have inklings of something more, much, much more. And it is that much, much more I will explore in the class on myth and meaning in the Inklings.